This is my other pet, the sourdough starter. It's a natural leavening agent we've been using for millennia before we invented commercial yeast. And you can make it yourself. The good news is if you have water, flour, and 6 days ahead of you, well, that's all you're gonna need. Especially since we're gonna repeat the exact same process every single day, and that's not even gonna take a minute per day. And in the end, you're gonna have an active starter that you're just gonna have to feed regularly, and it's gonna stay in your life forever. A sourdough starter is a mix of flour and water that ferments naturally. So the first order of business is to trigger fermentation. To get there ASAP, I'm gonna mix 25 grams of wheat flour, white or whole grain, it's up to you, and 25 grams of whole grain rye flour, because rye is full of nutrients that wild yeast and bacteria love. And I'll add 50 grams of water at room temperature. And if you use tap water, I recommend letting it sit until chlorine evaporates, because chlorine's job is to kill microbes, and it won't differentiate between the ones that make you sick and the ones we want to promote. The alternative is bottled water, if you don't have the time or the choice. I'll mix well so that there's no trace of dry flour left, and I'll put a lid on it. Just put the lid on. If it's a screw lid, don't screw it all the way, because fermentation releases CO2, and if it has nowhere to escape, well, we could end up with an exploding jar. The next morning looks like nothing happened, and if you do a little smell test,
it just smells like wet flour.
Getting the microorganisms to multiply takes time. At this stage, the surrounding bacteria and yeasts only want one thing: food. So that's what we're gonna keep giving them. So I'll take half of the content of the jar, meaning 50 grams, and the other half will go in the trash. And I'll repeat the operation from the day before by adding 50 grams of water, 25 grams of rye flour, and 25 grams of wheat flour. A little mixing, and I'll put the lid on and wait for another 24 hours. Until the evening, it barely inflated. And I thought that nothing was happening, so I turned off the camera for the night. Except that the next morning it blew up, so the yeast and bacteria must have multiplied. But my starter is not yet ready. It doesn't smell sour at all yet, which would be evidence that it's ready. Okay, now you know the drill, so take 50 grams of the mixture again, throw away the rest, add 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. And this time we see much less activity than the day before. It barely rises. This is pretty typical after the second day growth, but it's gonna vary widely depending on the flour, water, and the environment. So let's feed this thing again. And on day 4, my baby starter grows barely more than on day 3, so we haven't reached the stage of mature sourdough starter yet. One feeding later, and on day 5, we're almost there. My starter almost doubled in size, but we're gonna persevere for one last round, because I know it can go even bigger. The point of waiting at least 6 days before using it is to ensure that it's stable, because for now it's a young, brash starter with ups and downs, and I want a reliable adult starter 100% of the time. So let's feed this baby one more time. And finally, day 6, here we are. My starter is full of life and air bubbles. You can see that it's at least doubled in size. And it smells really good. In my opinion at least. It's really the smell of a successful fermentation. There's a sweet acidity. It's like a mix of beer, brioche, and even champagne aromas in a way. So now if I want to, I can use it in a bread recipe. And I'll keep in mind to leave a small quantity in the jar, so I can feed it again by adding water and flour. And from now on, I have a starter for the rest of my life, as long as I take care of it. If I leave it at room temp, it'll need food, preferably every day or every other day. You won't need to take as much as before to feed it though. If there's only a little left in the jar, that's gonna be more than enough. If you don't want to waste it by throwing away some of it every time you feed it, or if you go on vacation or take a break from baking, you can put it in the fridge for weeks on end, no problem, and take it out to feed it whenever you want to use it in a recipe. To replace yeast with a sourdough, a basic guideline is 6 grams of dry yeast or 14 grams of fresh yeast are equivalent to about 100 grams of sourdough starter, and proofing time is approximately doubled, but that will also depend on room temp. Anyway, now that I have a sourdough starter, I've never needed to buy yeast again, and I use it to make bread, brioches, and even Neapolitan pizzas. But that's a story for another day.